The third reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. In those days, a decree went out from the Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration, and it was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So all went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child, and she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. He came from a little town, Nazareth. He's directed to go to another little town, little town of Bethlehem. According to archaeologists, we think that the population of both Nazareth and Bethlehem was about 100 people. So, little town indeed. Now, if you've met my wife, 5-foot dynamo of a person, obviously better looking than I am. We do not look like a matched set. She's in every way, it seems, better than me. She's a better tennis player. She's certainly the best Christian in our household. She's the real thing. But what you might not know on first glance is that she's all kind of smart. I mean, she's really, really bright. She was the salutatorian of her high school graduating class in Memphis, Tennessee. For those of you who were nowhere close to that, salutatorian means second highest grade point average, had to give a little speech at graduation. She's salutatorian. Now, there's almost nothing that I'm better at than Connie, but I was the valedictorian of my high school class, the highest grade point average, and we've had many long years arguing about how that's one thing that I finally got. Now, I need a little help with this, so when you see Connie, help correct her, because here's the deal. She thinks it's a big deal that her graduating class had 900 students in it, of which she was second. She thinks it's important to say that my class had 19 students in it. But I say back to her, over half of my graduating class graduated in the top 10 in the class. So the competition was severe in my high school class. I'm the valedictorian, right? Am I right? Yeah, well, when you see her, you straighten that little salutatorian out for me. Okay, so I'm from a small town. Is anybody else from a small town, rural America or small town? How many of you grew up, lived part of your life trapped in a small town? You know, it didn't used to be this way. 200 years ago, at the census of 1820, 95% of America lived in small towns or rural America. 95%. Almost nobody lived in a big town. 100 years later, in 1920, that was the year when 50-50, one half of the people in America lived in cities and only half lived in small towns. The census we just took in 2020, as you'd imagine, has continued more. Now 82% of people in America live in cities and only 18% live in small towns or rural America. 82% of the people live in 3% of the land mass, while the other 18% are scattered out in 97% of the land mass. So if I were to ask this question 20 years from now, apparently nobody much would raise their hands. But some of us grew up in small towns. towns. You know, and there's a lot about small towns that can get on people's nerves. You hear it mocked all the time. Paul Simon has a song about my little town, and he talks about how he grew up feeling like nothing but just his father's boy, and he couldn't wait to get out of town like a hand itching on a trigger finger because there's nothing but the dead and dying back in my little town. Remember that song? Nothing but the dead and dying back in my little town. And towns sometimes can be gossipy, sometimes they can be provincial. First church I served was in a little town. A woman died. I was getting ready to do her service. I read in the obituary, it said in our little local paper, although she had only lived here 60 years, she had made some friends, it said. Because she wasn't from here, you know. So yeah, there's that. And sometimes towns get kind of stuck. Mary Chapin Carpenter has this wonderful song. It's called I Am a Town. It's a town talking to itself, as if a town could talk. But in her song, she says, I am a town. It says, I am memory and stillness. I am clinging to my ways. I am a town. On the interstate I-35 between Dallas and Austin, there's a sign that tries to lure you off the interstate to go to a little town that must be set up like a Cracker Barrel, I guess. It says Green, Texas, and here's the logo on the sign. It says Green, Texas, gently resisting change for 159 years. Okay, that's the way small towns can be, but I get it. But small towns also have an endearing, tender side to them too, right? If you're from a small town, you know what I mean. There's something quaint and beautiful and wonderful. The old African proverb about that it takes a village to raise a child. Maybe the biblical phrase would be it takes a town to raise a child, because maybe God desired everybody to kind of find their little town. Towns have a wonderful belonging to them. I've been gone from Fort Payne, Alabama for 40 years, but if I walked down our one-street town, Galt Avenue, today, I wouldn't get past 3rd Street before somebody would say, oh, glad you're here. You're one of Jim's boys, aren't you? Tell your mom hi, and I'd love to have another piece of that chocolate pie. She makes it so good. They just never forget. It's in a little town, marching down Galt Avenue at Christmas parades. That's where I learned that you don't want to march behind the horses. You're from a small town, you know. It's in a little town that you get this kind of accountability. I remember when I left my girlfriend's house at 11:05, my curfew was 11 o'clock. I thought if I drove fast enough, I might get home in time. Don't know why I thought that, but so I'm in my dad's big green pickup truck, and people saw the green flash, apparently, as I was trying to get home. I had not gotten home thinking I was going to sneak in. Mom and Dad are there waiting for me because they'd gotten 3 calls already from people who recognized the green flash passing by, and it must be one of Jim and Mary's boys. And I mean, I was ambushed before I got anywhere. If I got in trouble in 4th period in high school, my mom knew by 5th period, right? That's what it meant to be in a little town. My first job was at Walworth's Drugs there on Galt Avenue. I'm 15 years old. Somehow he gives me a job. My first job is pushing drugs, and I'm 15 years old. This is scary for me to think about. I'm filling prescriptions. It could have been Viagra or blood pressure medicine. I don't know, but somehow the town survived, and we just kind of helped each other through. A little town where I was a pastor, we had a single postmaster, handled every single piece of mail. I had a seminary classmate who made fun of me for going to pastor in a small town. He sent me a 6-month subscription to a magazine with a cover on top of it that just said secret and confidential, don't open. Knowing my postmaster would see that every single time. So 6 months in a row, I had to make sure I handed it back to Mabel unopened, saying, would you throw this away? My ex-friend sent this to me. But when you live in a small town, people, they know stuff, right? They keep up. In a small town at the cemetery, when you walk through, everybody knows who those people are. You still have Decoration Day, the 3rd Sunday in May, and you clean out all the weeds and you remember because they're your family or people who are almost like family. I love a small town. Small towns have histories. Small towns have belonging. But small towns also hurt and rejoice with each other. When people would come home from the war for me growing up there was Vietnam. When someone came home from the war in Fort Payne, we didn't throw rocks at them. We celebrated. The whole town The whole town, one of our sons had come home. And in the same way, when the news came that someone wasn't going to come home, the entire town grieved. It was one of their sons. And in my little town, when there was a funeral procession down Galt Avenue, all the cars stopped. And men took hats off of their heads. And everyone stood with respect. And you didn't have to know who was in the hearse, but like a John Donne poem, you knew for whom the bell tolled. There's something beautiful about a small town, isn't there? Right? And when you live in a big city, sometimes what we try to do is we try to find our small town again. I live in a community here in Bonita Springs. When you come in the gate, the person comes out of the gate and waves at you like we're a little town together. I don't know if he knows who we are, but it sure is friendly. I love that, actually. And within our community, we have other little sub-communities called HOAs, which is a way of extracting taxation and dues. But it also creates this sense that we're neighbors, because when you live in a big place, you have to somehow find your little town. If you're part of a big church like this, you got to find your little town. This is a small town. It's actually a big town, this choir, but it's kind of a medium-sized city here. But the group of ushers, elders and deacons, the group goes into a Bible study. Have you found your village, your small town? In big cities, in San Francisco, there's Chinatown. And in New York, there's West Village and Little Italy. Do you find your little village? The truth is, we were made to be in small town. Accountability and warmth and connection, where people can feel and bear your pain and your joy. So Phillips Brooks, the Episcopal priest, visits the little town of Bethlehem, moved to pen those wonderful words. And yes, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. It's a very pastoral scene. Little town of Bethlehem, silent, sleeping like a little baby, but in many ways also sleeping like a corpse. Because Bethlehem was a town that was riddled with a history of tears. It's not accidental that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We first hear of it back in the book of Genesis. Jacob has two wives. Leah, the firstborn that Laban kind of hoisted off on him, has babies every time he passes by her tent. But he really loves Rachel. And Rachel finally has a child named Joseph. She names the child Joseph, which is, add me another one. I'm only 5 behind Leah now. And so finally she does get another one, but she dies giving birth to him. And she names him in her last breath Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. And her beloved husband, grieving Jacob, just can't name him that every time he calls him, and so he renamed him Benjamin, son of my right hand. But Rachel, the maternal grandmother of Israel, is buried in Bethlehem. And the book of Jeremiah talks about that all through the centuries, Rachel in Bethlehem weeps for her children. And the book of Matthew will quote that text again when Herod the Great will come through, having been deceived by the wise men, and slaughter every child under 2 years old in Bethlehem. And Rachel will again weep for her children. Now, Bethlehem's just a little town. It might not have been but 3 or 4 children, but it doesn't matter. In a little town, the entire town is grieved. We next hear of Bethlehem when Naomi, who had a husband and 2 sons, they venture off to Moab, and there the husband and both sons die. And she comes limping back to Bethlehem, her hometown. And everybody, like a little town, says, "Oh, Naomi, you're back. Welcome back. It's been 20 years, but glad you're back." And she says, "Don't call me Naomi anymore." Naomi in Hebrew means pleasant one. Call me now Mara. Mara means bitter. I left full and I've come back empty. Bethlehem was a town that knew some real sorrow. And so Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And I'm wondering if there's somebody here today, this Christmas, who's having trouble having Christmas because it doesn't feel all light and airy like it should, right? It feels like, your Christmas is one of those like modern movies like Four Christmases or a Steve Martin kind of movie. It's just, there's Uncle Ed who gets into the eggnog too much, and then he wants to talk about politics over a Christmas dinner, and it all gets ruined. Or there's the turkey that burns, or there's the child that spit up all over the Christmas pajamas before the picture was taken. It's that kind of Christmas. Or maybe for you, it's the first Christmas since the death or the diagnosis. And it just doesn't feel like Christmas because it doesn't feel light and airy. You listen on the radio and there's Bing Crosby crooning along. Have yourself a merry little Christmas. Let your heart be light. From now on, our troubles will be out of sight. Have yourself a merry little Christmas. Make the Yuletide gay. From now on, our troubles will be miles away. Right? Because that's how Christmas should be. Here we are as in olden days, happy golden days of yore. Family and friends who are dear to us, they're gathering near to us once more. Now that's how Christmas ought to be, right? Hang your highest star upon the highest bough and have yourself a merry little Christmas now. Well, that was 1954. And gas was selling for 19 cents a gallon. We'd won the war. You could buy a Chevy for $3,000 and a house for $21,000. We'd won the war. We were running things, and the boys had come back, been educated by the GI Bill, and suburbs were popping up everywhere because baby boomers like me were popping out everywhere, and everything seemed to be going great, and Bing Crosby said, now there's a Christmas song. But did you know, that's not the original words to that song. That song, which he demanded to be rewritten to be more chirpy and happy, was actually written 10 years earlier for Judy Garland, as in Wizard of Oz. Judy Garland was playing in a movie called Meet Me in St. Louis, and it was 1944. Does any history buff in here remember what was going on in the world in 1944? What's that? World War II. 1944 at Christmas, which is when that movie came out, was the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima. It was nowhere certain on either side whether this thing was going to come out. And in every little town, caskets were coming home again and again and again. And the mood was much more somber. And the original words that Judy Garland sang in that movie were this: have yourself a merry little Christmas, it may be our last. By next year, we'll be living in the past. Have yourself a merry little Christmas, pop the champagne cork. By next year, we may have to be living in New York. Gone are the olden days, the happy golden days of yore. Faithful friends who were dear to us will be near to us no more. So at least we'll all be together if the Lord allows. But in the meantime, we'll just have to muddle through somehow. Those are the original words. Somebody might be having a Bing Crosby Christmas this year. There's nothing to feel guilty about that. If you're soaring with angels or you're like a wise man with a pocket full of gold, smelling like frankincense, there's not a thing wrong. But if your Christmas feels more like Judy Garland's Christmas, this musical Sunday, what we want to say to you is not all the Christmas music has to be played in a major key, Joy to the World dancing its way down a scale. Some Christmas music can also be played in a minor key. The joy of this pink candle is different than happiness. Happy is your stocks are up and your PSA is down. Things are going well. The right family came and they didn't stay too long. That's happy. Joy, the pink candle, joy can be weathered, tear-stained, fisted, determined faith with tears rolling down your cheeks, and yet it still is joy. it is possible as a human being to feel more than one thing at once, like when your child played out in the street and you felt fear and anger at the same time. It's possible to feel joy and deep sorrow, or to feel alone when you're in a crowd. Philip Brooks said it right: the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee, O little town of Bethlehem, tonight. What I love about a small town is that they'll dance with you down Galt Avenue, but they'll also sit with you in front of Eberhardt's store and weep and say nothing but be with you. And so Jesus came to a little town. So Burl Ives sings on the radio another really wonderful carol. But again, it's a carol where a lot of the original words never make it because we just want a cleaned up Hallmark Christmas that just happens to miss a lot of us. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was one of those rare cats that was actually an acclaimed poet who made money and people loved him as a popular poet, but he also was loved by the critics. He was actually a professor of romantic languages at Harvard. He was the first American poet enshrined in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. This is a very popular, successful guy. But in 1861, his beloved wife, while making Christmas decorations, got too close to the fire. I don't know exactly how it started, but suddenly the dress she was wearing went up in flames like a Roman candle. She cried out in anguish. He was only 10 steps away in the study, and he came running into the drawing room, and there was his wife perishing in these flames, and he ran over to her and tried to and did extinguish the flames, but severely marred his hands and face for the rest of his life trying to save his wife's life, and yet it was of no avail. He took her up to the bedroom, and she died there 2 days later. 3 days later, buried on their 18th anniversary. He couldn't even attend because he was still fighting for his own life. His only son, Charles, had enlisted in the Union Army against Daddy's wishes. Just couldn't stay out of the fight because everybody thought it'd only be about 3 months. It might be over before he missed it. But in 1863, you history buffs, what was happening in 1863? The Civil War. In the Civil War, more American lives were lost, 655,000, than in all other American wars, all added up, put together. All of those wouldn't be within even 200,000 of the losses during the Civil War. Every little town was grieved again and again from Mississippi to Maine. And in 1863, there was no clue how this thing was going to end or if it would ever end. And on December 1st, Longfellow's son was mortally wounded in a battle. He found his son in a hospital, and on Christmas morning, while trying to nurse or wait or watch and hope his son might live, he began to hear the church bells ringing out the Christmas carols. And it was comforting in a way, but also poignantly sad because it didn't feel that way to him. Would it to you? I heard the bells on Christmas Day, he wrote. Their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. But in the melancholy and the darkness of his grief, he actually wrote these words, although Burl Ives doesn't sing them. So here's the rest of that poem. But from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. And in despair, I bowed my head. There's no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong And it mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That was the only honest song he could sing. And it might be yours too. But I'm here to tell you this morning, that's a Christmas song too. But he's a man of faith, and with tears coming down his deformed cheeks, he grew that big beard later that you always see to cover it up. But he wrote the last stanza. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong will fail, the right prevail. With peace on earth, goodwill to men. Friends, I don't know whether you're a wise man smelling like frankincense, or an angel soaring in heaven, or a shepherd up to your knees in sheep dung. But whichever you are, this Christmas story is built for all of you. Merry Christmas. To this little town, he has come. And Philip Brooks knew this. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. It just feels like we ought to sing Philip Brooks' song, right? O little town of Bethlehem, don't you think?